Hey everyone, welcome back to the Ethics Essay Clinic. My name is Eric Matheson. In the last video, I went through the kind of background or foundational things about writing an ethics paper. In this video, I'm going to go through a paper and in detail and show you how I would go about grading it. A couple details before we look at that. One of them is that this is a paper for my Introduction to Bioethics course. So this course is it's a second-year course, but there are no prerequisites. So most of the students taking this course have never taken a philosophy course before, and most of them are not philosophy majors. They're mainly from science major of one type or another. A couple other things, I give students prompts ahead of time, so they're not specific questions, but they're guidelines or suggestions about how to approach the paper. They can, when I frame the prompt, they can be more specific or more general than that. It's up to them. And another thing is that in my courses, or for this type of course, students are not allowed to look at outside sources. So I want students to focus on developing their own arguments. I don't want them to spend a lot of time looking at outside material and finding arguments and then writing them down. The reason I do this is that what I care about for this level is getting students to think about arguments themselves, to develop objections, and to come up with responses. Down the road, if they're going into upper year classes, then research is an important skill that they're going to have to develop. And so that will be a factor in other courses. But for this course, I want them to just look at the material that they have and then go from there. Okay, let's dive in. So this student wrote a paper on one of the topics I go over in the course, advanced directives. An advanced directive is, if you execute an advanced directive, you are stating your wishes for what you want to happen to you if you lose your ability to make decisions for yourself. So they're sometimes also called living wills, personal directives, and other things. And the readings that we use in this course, the main one is by Rebecca Dresser, who argues that that we shouldn't follow advanced directives all of the time. So some brief background on that is that she's talking about a case that's written by another paper by a philosopher named Ronald Dworkin. And they're talking about this case of this woman named Margot, who, when she had her decision-making capacity, she said, if I ever get advanced dementia and I'm no longer able to make decisions for myself, I don't want to be kept alive. If I get an infection or something like that, then I don't want to be cured of that. Let me die comfortably. Ronald Dworkin argues that we should follow Margot's advanced directive. But Dresser argues that we shouldn't follow Margot's directive because, she gives a bunch of different reasons. But one of the important features of the case is that Margot she has advanced dementia. She no longer recognizes people in her life. She no longer remembers things about her past life. But besides that, she's doing fine. She's happy. She seems to be enjoying herself. She watches TV. She does some painting. So in terms of the quality of her life, although it's changed dramatically from how it used to be, she's not clearly suffering or experiencing any negative well-being in that sense. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to read a paragraph and then talk about the paragraph. So this student, one of the things immediately that stands out is that the paper is organized very clearly. So the student starts off by the first section is called thesis, and it says, in this paper, I will argue that advanced directives of dementia patients should be fulfilled to protect the bodily autonomy of their pre-dementia selves. So that is a great thesis in terms of clarity. If you read that thesis statement, you understand immediately what the person is going to be arguing for. Advanced directives of dementia patients should be fulfilled. And there's also kind of a sketch of the reason because it relates to bodily autonomy. So clarity, very good. The next section is called context. And so let me read that out to you. Advance directives extend one's autonomy, granting people control when they are no longer in a position to make decisions for themselves. I will draw upon the case of Margot, a dementia patient who previously issued a formal document asking to end her life if she developed her current illness. While Margot is substantially impaired, she retains the capacity for enjoyment and interaction. Dresser believes that Margot should be kept alive, as considerable memory loss and other psychological changes have produced a new person, nullifying the advance directive. Thus, previous Margot's wishes do not have moral authority over current Margot, the dementia patient. So, once again, I think that in terms of clarity, it's very clearly written. It's very easy to follow. The student is giving just the essentials for what we need to understand. In one sentence, explaining what advance directives do, and then giving a quick sketch of the case about Margot and about Dresser's view. So this is also really well done. It's easy to follow. There's not any extraneous background stuff that isn't going to be relevant. It's just what we need. So far, doing great. Next, we get into what the student calls the colonization argument. So this is also, because it's got argument, this is a nice kind of setup for, okay, I think we're going to get the student's argument now. I argue that previous Margot still has claims over her body, even if a new person is inhabiting it. When one is diagnosed with dementia, they must face that their psychological connectedness will slowly dissolve, taking away the psychological aspects that make up who they are. So this is a claim that we talked about in the course that's advocated by a philosopher named Jeff McMahon, that we lose who we are, our personhood dissolves in a case like dementia. And that what it means to exist as a person is psychological continuity across time, which is what dementia robs us of. There's no consent involved in this process. For instance, imagine I am informed that someone is going to forcibly come and live in my home, and I have no choice but to accept that I will be displaced. Most people would agree that I, the original homeowner, should be able to exercise my autonomy and decide what happens to it. Therefore, to prevent this new, uninvited person from living in the home I built and nurtured, I decide to break down the house. This response seems justified, as the encroacher who forcibly entered my home did not have permission to be there in the first place. A similar logic can be applied to Margot's case. While she did not possess control over losing her psychological connectedness and having a new person occupy her body, Margot should have the right to control what happens to her body once that new person enters. So, the student here is making a creative analogy. So you remember that after clarity, the next of the four things to look for is creativity. And the student is making this analogy between dementia and somebody whose house gets occupied. Now, that's a creative argument. If we were going to have a long kind of discussion about this, we could discuss to what extent the analogy works. But I understand the analogy. I see kind of what the connection is supposed to be. Seems plausible to me, so I'm kind of on board. The student describes what we should think about it. For instance, imagine I am informed that someone is going to forcibly come and live in my home, and I have no choice but to accept that I will be displaced. Most people would agree that I, the original homeowner, should be able to exercise my autonomy and to decide what happens to it. Okay, interesting. So not just kind of sketching the thought experiment, but also giving us a sense of what we should think about it. The next section is called the balancing interests objection. So the student has given the argument, and we can easily tell from the heading of the next section that we're going to get an objection. So let's see. A potential objection could be that limiting Margot's autonomy is justified because honoring her wishes involves harming an innocent bystander, rather than an overt intruder. By extension, the person invading my home is not aware that it already had an owner, and that their occupancy will uproot me. Thus, my choice to break down the home will have killed the new innocent occupant in the process. Here it may seem more reasonable to leave the home undamaged to save an innocent life. Analogously, saving post-dementia, happy Margot's life appears to be more significant than honoring the autonomy of past Margot, who no longer exists. So the main objection that the student is giving to their own argument is that perhaps there's an issue with the analogy. that the original framing of the analogy is that there's this intruder who's going to kind of take over your house. And in that case, most of us are going to agree that we have the right to decide what happens to our house. But one way that dementia is not like that, you might think, is that, well, the person who's going to occupy our body is not an intruder in a kind of malicious sense. It's more this kind of person who wasn't aware of what was happening, just kind of stumbled upon this house and didn't realize that occupying it would mean evicting the person who was living there before. I think that that's a pretty plausible objection. If so, then that gives us some reason to be doubtful about the original argument, that it seems like there's this problem with the analogy, that the analogy doesn't totally work. So in terms of an objection, in terms of giving a strong objection, I think that this is a good objection because now I agree with the objection. I'm a bit skeptical about it. So the objection is reasonable, makes a good point against the original argument, and the student sums it up nicely with this last sentence. Analogously, saving post-dementia happy Margot's life appears to be more significant than honoring the autonomy of past Margot, who no longer exists. So we've got this person who's existing now, the kind of current Margot, and so maybe that person is more important, where we should give that person more significance in our deliberations than what we should to past Margot. Interesting. Let's go on. Response. So this is where in the paper you give the argument, you consider an objection against the argument, but you don't want to leave us with the objection. You want to explain to us why the objection fails, which is supposed to be to kind of defend the original argument. So let's see. My response to the objection is that because dementia patients are involuntarily stuck in a condition where their ability to make autonomous choices will eventually no longer exist, it is increasingly important to honor their pre-dementia wishes. Generally, when someone is struggling with a life-threatening condition in which their non-existence is approaching, those around them try to fulfill their desires to better their last days. For example, the entire premise of the popular Make-A-Wish Foundation is to honor children with critical illnesses by granting them life-changing wishes, despite their imminent passing. This should not be any different for dementia patients. Past Margot created the advance directives because she did not want her body to exist in a world where she would lose her psychological connectedness. Refusing to honor past Margot's wishes imposes a double standard on individuals who are diagnosed with life-altering dementia, disregarding their wishes to prioritize a new person's needs. So the argument here is, I think, that in general, we have this belief that we should honor people's wishes by trying to fulfill their wishes before they're gone. I think that's what the connection is to the Make-A-Wish Foundation. And so the student the argument is that if that's the case, if we have this kind of general principle of respecting people's wishes, of fulfilling them, then we should do that in the case of Margot. Now, I think that this is the least strong part of the paper, because I think that there is just a disanalogy between the Make-A-Wish Foundation, which is fulfilling the wishes of a person who is present and is going to experience it, and any kind of advance directive, which is meant to fulfill the wishes of somebody who can no longer make decisions. I think what it actually just might have been more straightforward to say that, look, we care about advance directives in general. Most people care what happens to their bodies and to them even when they're no longer able to make their decisions. That's what advance directives are doing, and so that's kind of the point about it. Another way that I think that this response could have been improved is to direct it more directly at the objection. So the objection is about the analogy. The original analogy is that dementia is like a home intruder, and so we're allowed to protect our property. The objection, which I think is a good objection, is that, well, it's not really like a malicious intruder. It's more like somebody who kind of stumbles upon it without realizing what they're doing. And so I think the best response to that would be to say something about that kind of intruder hapless person analogy. And instead, the response kind of changes direction and gives us a new argument for in favor of the initial view. Now, it's still directed at the original argument, so it's still a type of defense. But I think that that's one way that that response could have been improved. All right, the last paragraph. Additionally, I will invoke Thompson's, that's Judith Jarvis Thomson, her widely agreed upon pro-choice abortion argument to address why advance directives should be fulfilled even if it kills the post-dementia individual. Thomson employs two relevant analogies. The first involves a kidnapped person who is forcibly hooked up to a violinist for 9 months because it is the only way to save the violinist's life. The second consists of people seeds falling into a home through the window and slowly developing into human beings, despite taking all necessary precautions to avoid the situation. In both cases, Thompson concludes that autonomy and consent take precedence. The person has the right to unhook themselves, even if it means killing the violinist, and the seeds can be rightfully removed, even if it stops the human being from developing. Consequently, promoting past Margot's autonomy is still crucial, even if it results in the death of new Margot. So the student is offering us another argument here for why we should care about autonomy. And if you know Thompson's paper, the basis of her argument throughout in defending the right to abortion in some cases is based on autonomy. So it's another autonomy argument. I have kind of two thoughts about this. One of them is that I think it would have been better for the student to just stick to one response. So there's the kind of Make-A-Wish response, pro-autonomy response, and then there's the Judith Thomson pro-autonomy response. In a way, they're both kind of making the same point. So they're focused on the same thing. But I think it would have been better just to choose one or the other and then dig into that. So to really kind of focus on depth of the argument instead of giving us these two separate points. The second thought is that it seems to me that this response has the same issue as the first one, which is that in Thompson's case, these are all people who have autonomy right now. So, but in the advance directive case, we're talking about a person who no longer has autonomy, is no longer able to make her own decisions. And so I think that that is a relevant difference. It's totally plausible to hold the view that people who are able to make their own decisions, they have autonomy. We should respect their wishes. But once you lose the capacity to make your own decisions, then you no longer have autonomy. And so we should just use a different sort of approach. So I think an argument that was sensitive to that would do a better job. All things considered, though, this was an A paper. I think this paper is excellent. It's clear. It's creative with the analogy. I think in terms of difficulty in execution, I think that there's a nice balance here. The student is making an interesting case for a somewhat controversial view. I think overall the execution is really good. I think that as I've said, that there's room for improvement in some ways, but that's always going to be the case. So overall, excellent paper. This is a paper that I would give an A, and that's what the student got in the course. So that is an example of an A-level paper for this level of course, a introductory course that has no prerequisites. In the next videos, I'm going to go through a B-level paper and a C-level paper, B grade and C grade, to show what the differences are. And then that'll give us a sense of how to improve. How can you go from a C to a B? How can you go from a B to an A? So look forward to seeing you in the next video.